Welcome to Chapter 6 is about learning. Another name for this field is behavioral psychology. You may remember from our first lecture series that behaviorists came right after the psychoanalysts, and behaviorists focus on what you can observe. Well, behaviorism has largely faded away, but learning is still something that we study. So what is learning? Learning is a change in behavior that results from experience. It's a relatively enduring change in behavior. This change results from experience, the effect of us participating in our environment. We can learn things such as what foods make us sick, or when we should sleep, or what sounds indicate danger. Learning facilitates survival. It is a part of all aspects of our existence. It's how we know to walk, talk, and write. It's how we know social values, cultural norms, and how to maintain relationships. So we're going to talk about 3 different types of conditioning. The 3 types of learning that we're going to discuss is classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and observational learning. So this first lecture is going to focus just on classical conditioning, and then the next lecture in the series will focus on operant and observational. So classical conditioning. A little bit of history about classical conditioning comes, like I said, from the behaviorist movement. It arose in the early 20th century, and one of the main thinkers was John Watson. John Watson argued that only observable behavior was a valid indicator of psychological activity. This was coming from as a reaction to the psychoanalyst movement. The psychoanalysts, or if you remember, wanted to focus on what people could remember and unconscious thought and all of this different stuff. And John Watson and the other behaviorists wanted to focus on simply something that you could observe, that a third party could observe about a person, and didn't require the person's introspection at all. And so John Watson thought that the environment and its effects were the sole determinants of learning, that there was nothing particular about the person that was influencing it. It was dominant into the 1960s and had a huge influence on every area of psychology. Many of the principles remain as relevant today as they were more than 50 years ago, but we focus a little bit more on other things besides just behavior. Something about John Watson that is interesting is that he once said that one of the reasons he's pretty controversial is that he once said, "Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed, and my own specified world in which to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take anyone at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select. Doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant, chief, and yes, even beggarman and thief, regardless of his talents, penchants, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and race of his ancestors." So this is quite controversial, and as you read it, you might see why it might be controversial. But John Watson believed that you could make anything out of anyone based on how you raised them and what environment you provided for them. And so we're going to go on into conditioning and what conditioning is, and maybe you can think about this quote as we go through the next 2 lecture series and see what you think about this quote. All right, so Watson was mainly influenced by Ivan Pavlov's research on the salivary reflex. I don't know if you've heard about Pavlov and his work with dogs, but Pavlov did research on salivation in dogs, which is an automatic response to a food stimulus. And so even in humans, when food is placed in front of you and you're really hungry, or if you smell food and you're really hungry, you may notice that you start to salivate. And so Pavlov noticed that the dogs he was studying were salivating as soon as they saw the bowls that contained food. And even as soon as they saw the people who usually fed them. So this was suggesting that it wasn't just about the food, but about the cues that meant food was coming. So he wanted to study this a little bit more. Okay, so the definition of classical conditioning is when a neutral object begins to elicit a response when it is associated with a stimulus that already produces that response. So that's a lot of words that maybe don't make a lot of sense. We're going to watch a quick video that may give you a little bit more information about this, and then we'll talk about it a little bit more.
Behavioral psychologists have come up with new views, not only of animal behavior, but of human nature as well. And these views all concern a process that we take for granted, learning, because we are all truly born to learn. Ironically, one of the most important figures in the study of learning, Ivan Pavlov, wasn't concerned with the subject at all, at least not at first. Pavlov, a noted Russian scientist, won the Nobel Prize for Physiology and Medicine in 1904. As this original footage shows, Pavlov was initially interested in digestion and the action of the salivary glands. By diverting the saliva of dogs into test tubes, he could precisely measure if and how much they salivated during digestion. When food was presented, the dogs salivated quickly, an inherited salivary reflex. But over repeated testings, a strange thing happened. The dogs salivated before contact with the food. Just the sight of the food was enough to stimulate their drooling. Then, just seeing the food dish, or even hearing the footsteps of Pavlov or his assistants, was enough to trigger this built-in reflex. What was going on to elicit this response? Pavlov decided to find out by systematically varying the stimuli and measuring the dog's reaction. Metronomes, lights, and bells were all used as stimuli, and they all worked as stand-ins for the food. What mattered was not the kind of stimulus that was used, but the fact that it reliably signaled that food was on the way. Pavlov had discovered a fundamental type of learning called classical conditioning. An original stimulus elicits an automatic, unlearned response. Both stimulus and response happen naturally. They are unconditioned. Then a second, neutral stimulus that never elicits the unconditioned response by itself is introduced just before the presentation of the original stimulus. If the neutral or signaling stimulus is presented alone, and a response occurs as if the original stimulus were still there, we say that conditioning has taken place. The arbitrary neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus. The reverse is also true. Pavlov and others studied the extinction over time of such conditioned responses. When the subject learns that the conditioned stimulus no longer signals a desired event, the acquisition process is reversed, as the learned connection is gradually weakened. Pavlov's work, and the work of those who followed him, led to a remarkable conclusion, and that is, any stimulus an organism can perceive is capable of eliciting any reaction the organism is capable of making. This means that virtually any sound, sight, or smell can influence the way our muscles tense or relax, our moods fluctuate, or even the way our attitudes are formed. For instance, if I say, relax, and then do this, you're going to be startled and upset. after 5 or 6 pairings of relax. Just saying the word relax is going to generate a negative response rather than its usual learned reaction.
Okay, so that is Philip, and we're actually going to talk a little bit more later in the semester. But he's a pretty famous psychologist, and he at one point in his career he began creating educational videos like this one. All right, so don't know if you caught all of the terms that we're gonna go over. We're gonna go over them several times during this lecture so that we can make sure that you understand them. But essentially, this is what Pavlov studied. That before conditioning, just an unlearned response is that food causes salivation. So Pavlov paired a bell with food so that, and before learning, the bell does not cause salivation. So food causes salivation naturally, but naturally a bell does not cause salivation. So Pavlov began ringing a bell when he fed the dogs. And because the food was there, the dogs were salivating. And so he kept ringing the bell, presenting the food, and that produced salivation. After the dogs had learned that the bell was paired with food, ringing the bell would produce salivation. So these are the terms that you need to know. The food is the unconditioned stimulus. So this is a natural stimulus that produces a reaction, a response. The salivation is the unconditioned response. So salivation is the natural response to food. The bell is a neutral stimulus. It does not produce the natural response to food. Salivating to food, again, here, is a natural response to the food, right? After conditioning, the bell becomes a conditioned stimulus. It is a learned stimulus. And salivation to the bell is the learned response. In all of these relationships, the conditioned response and the unconditioned response should be the same. Okay, so we're going to go through several examples of classical conditioning, and we're going to really drive home these terms. These terms will for sure be on your test, and you are going to have to identify them all in a relationship. So I suggest that if you have any questions about this after we've gone through the lecture, please let me know. Okay, so just to define our terms, the unconditioned stimulus is the natural stimulus that elicits a response, such as a reflex, without any prior learning. So with the dogs, the salivation to food is something that is a reflex. It's natural. The unconditioned response is the salivation, so the response that does not have to be learned, such as a reflex. The conditioned stimulus is something that elicits a response only after learning has taken place. So that's the bell. The conditioned response is the response to the conditioned stimulus, the response that has been learned. Like I said before, the conditioned response and the unconditioned response are going to be the same in every case. Okay? Okay, so the process of classical conditioning is that first you have to have an unconditioned response and an unconditioned stimulus. Stimulus before the response. So you have to have an unconditioned stimulus and an unconditioned response. Then learning occurs if a neutral stimulus is paired with an unconditioned stimulus. And because the unconditioned stimulus produces the response, the pairing produces the response. Gradually, the neutral stimulus begins to elicit the conditioned response. Okay? So we're going to go through some examples of this. Okay, so this is a video of some of John Watson's research. This is another reason why he's a little bit controversial. This is known as the Little Albert Project. You may have heard of this one as well. I'm not going to make you watch the whole thing.
Watson and Rayner then sought to teach Albert to fear white rats through classical conditioning. In the conditioning phase of the study, which was not filmed, the investigators struck a steel bar with a hammer whenever Albert reached for a rat, making a very loud noise that greatly upset and frightened Albert. After 6 such pairings of the loud noise and the rat, it was believed that the boy had been conditioned to fear white rats. That is, Albert was now expected to react fearfully to white rats, whether the rats were paired with loud noises or not. In this next film sequence, we see Albert interacting with a white rat after the conditioning process. The investigators believed that the child's reaction during this trial demonstrated his newly acquired fear of white rats. Finally, the investigators expected that little Albert's conditioned fear of white rats would generalize to stimuli that were similar in key ways to a white rat. In this film segment, they were trying to demonstrate that the child now also reacted fearfully to similar objects, such as a rabbit, a dog, a furry object, and a white mask worn by Watson himself.
So like I said, this is one of the reasons why Watson is controversial. So Watson and his graduate student, Rosalie Rayner, took this child who had previously had no fear of white rats or rabbits or anything white and fuzzy, and conditioned him by striking a steel bar with a hammer over and over again whenever he was presented with a white rat. And he developed a fear of the white rat and generally anything fuzzy or anything that resembled a rat. This is known as stimulus generalization. His fear was generalized to things that resembled the white rat. This is largely why Watson's research has gone out of style, because he actually lost his position shortly after this experiment, because it was so harmful to the child. We don't know much about little Albert after these experiments, but we do know that he maintained his fear for the rest of his life. Okay, so now we're going to go into more examples. Or I'm going to go into a description of what little Albert's classical conditioning stimulus was. So first we had the bang, the hammer hitting the steel bar. That's the unconditioned stimulus, and that produced crying. We have the rat, which is the conditioned stimulus. These were associated, so every time that the rat was presented, the bang was also presented. And that produced crying. So that because the rat and the unconditioned stimulus, the hitting the hammer, were associated, it produced the same response, to the point where eventually presenting the rat alone produced the conditioned response of crying. Okay? All right. So let's go through some other videos and show you some of how learning exists in our population.
Hey Psych 101 class, I'm David, and I'm going to be testing Pavlov's theory of classical conditioning on my roommate Brian. The conditioned stimulus will be the sound effect.
That was easy.
And then I'm going to shoot him with this airsoft gun. He will soon learn the relationship between the sound effect and the shot before he gets too hurt.
That was easy. That was easy.
Ah!
That was easy.
Fuck.
That was easy. That was easy.
All right, guys, looks like Pavlov's theory worked.
All right, so this is something that a student created at another university to illustrate classical conditioning. His roommate began to anticipate getting shot with the airsoft gun when he heard the "that was easy" button. And so at the last time he flinched, even though he did not get shot. So what's the unconditioned stimulus? The unconditioned stimulus is whatever's shot out of an airsoft gun, the little dart or whatever it is. What's the conditioned stimulus? The conditioned stimulus is the "that was easy" button. What is the unconditioned response? The unconditioned response is, the unconditioned response is the flinch, right? And then the conditioned response is the flinch as well. Okay, so let's watch another video and see if that illustrates it better. Of course it has been. This is why I typically embed my videos in the PowerPoint. If I find this again, I'll upload it to the lectures folder with the lecture videos, and you can watch it and use it as an example to help illustrate classical conditioning. Okay, so let's go through another example. So what if you read in a magazine that if you wear a unique scent around your man and then spray a bit of it on his sheets, that way when you're not around, he will smell the scent and get turned on just thinking about you. Okay, so what's the unconditioned stimulus? The unconditioned stimulus is the girl. He gets turned on by the girl initially. So the unconditioned response is getting turned on, right? The conditioned response, the conditioned stimulus. What's the conditioned stimulus? The girl's perfume. What's the conditioned response? Getting turned on. Okay, so she pairs herself with the perfume and he gets turned on. And then eventually, if just her perfume is there, he will get turned on just thinking about her because of her perfume. Okay, let's do another one. You meet a new person who is an excellent cook. After a few superb meals, you find yourself liking that person very much. So what's the unconditioned stimulus? The unconditioned stimulus is the good food. The unconditioned response is liking the food or happiness. The conditioned stimulus. What's the conditioned stimulus? The person cooking the food. And the conditioned response is happiness. So because the new person is paired with the good food, you begin to be happy around that new person and like that person. This is where sometimes the conditioned response and the unconditioned response are similar, but not exactly the same. The emotion, so the happiness, is the same, but liking the food is not the exact same as liking the person, right? But you find yourself liking something or being happy around something, and it's because of the pairing of the cook with the food. Okay? Does that make sense? All right. So if you have any more questions about classical conditioning and identifying the conditioned stimulus, the conditioned response, the unconditioned stimulus, and the unconditioned response, please let me know, because it's really important that you be able to distinguish those four things when you're given, say, a paragraph like this. Okay, so now we're going to go into second order conditioning. So second order conditioning is when the conditioned stimulus becomes associated with something else that is associated with the unconditioned stimulus. So this is a more complex learning experience. So let's go to another pet. So say you feed your cat canned food. So your cat salivates or comes running when you put the wet food on the floor. But she begins to realize that if you're using your electric can opener, so she hears the electric can opener that opens the can of food, she comes running when she hears the electric can opener, or she salivates. You keep your electric can opener in a cabinet, and the cabinet has a squeaky door. So she begins to realize that if you're opening the cabinet door and it squeaks, you're then going to use the can opener to open a can of food for the cat. So she salivates or comes running when she hears the squeaky cabinet door. Okay? So this is a complex relationship where something like the squeaky cabinet door that's not directly related to the food elicits a response because it's related to the mediator of the conditioned stimulus. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay, we're going to talk a little bit more about this. So there are some terms that I want you to know. So first is acquisition. So acquisition is the term that we use to talk about learning. Acquisition is acquiring the skill or acquiring the relationship. So acquisition is how the conditioned response is first elicited. You have acquired the knowledge that X means Y, okay? And it occurs over several trials. Generalization is responding to a stimulus that is similar to the conditioned stimulus. So this is what happened to little Albert. Little Albert was afraid of cotton, a Santa Claus mask, and a fluffy white bunny, as well as the white rat, because they were similar to the white rat. Here's another example. Your significant other has dark hair and dark eyes. Your significant other often yells at you and makes you feel bad. Pretty soon you can't stand the look of that person and end the relationship. You meet another person who looks like your ex. Although they seem nice, you find yourself feeling bad every time you are around them. So this is generalization. Because you had a bad experience with a certain type of person, you begin to feel like you're going to have that experience with someone who looks similar. Okay? So in contrast to that, we have discrimination. And stimulus discrimination is knowing not to respond to a stimulus that is different to a conditioned stimulus. So little Albert was not afraid of a piece of wood. Discrimination is being able to know the difference between two items and not have the same response to all items, but just have the response to the conditioned stimulus. All right, and then extinction. Extinction happens when the conditioned stimulus is presented alone for repeated trials. The conditioned response weakens. Okay, so that means that if I rang the bell over and over and over again and never presented food, eventually the dog would stop salivating to the bell ringing. For my cat, if I used the can opener and wasn't giving her food, eventually she would stop salivating to the sound of the can opener. So that's extinction. The conditioned response slowly goes away when the conditioned stimulus is presented alone. Spontaneous recovery occurs when the conditioned stimulus is presented again. Sometimes you'll have a reaction to the conditioned stimulus, even if it's not paired with the unconditioned stimulus. You'll have a reaction to the conditioned stimulus that resembles the conditioned response. So something that I think of when I think of spontaneous recovery is the how many of you have iPhones, and the alarm sound that was on the iPhone that was like the Okay, I used to use that as my alarm to wake up. I don't anymore. But whenever I hear that sound, I immediately reach for my phone, right? Even though I don't use it anymore, it's not the sound that wakes me up, I still reach for my phone. So that's spontaneous recovery. Okay, so classical conditioning is also implicated in developing phobias or fears. So a phobia is an acquired fear out of proportion to the real threat of an object or of a situation. And this happens through fear conditioning, or classically conditioning animals to fear neutral responses. And so little Albert's fear of white fluffy things can be described as a phobia. The fear is out of proportion to the threat of the object. And typically in phobias, fears, the responses to the object that is the phobia include specific psychological and behavioral reactions, such as crying or jumping or heart rate increasing. So there are specific things that are associated with it. So the top 10 American fears are snakes, being buried alive, heights, being bound or tied up, drowning, public speaking, hell, cancer, tornadoes and hurricanes, and fire. There tend to be differences between men and women in these common fears. So for men, being buried alive, heights, snakes, drowning, and public speaking are the top 5. And for women, snakes, being bound or tied up, being buried alive, heights, or public speaking are the top 5. So you can see that public speaking is a pretty big fear for all of us. So some phobias we have specific names for. These are unusual, but we have names for them. So there is a name for the fear of peanut butter sticking to the roof of one's mouth. There's a fear of gravity, or barophobia. There's a fear of garden gnomes, known as nomophobia. There's even a fear of everything, panophobia. So there's some people have phobias to irrational things, and something about phobias is that it's usually characterized by an irrational response. The behavior that is associated with responding to your phobia is typically out of proportion to what is true of the phobia. So classical conditioning has also been used to treat phobias. This is known as counter conditioning. So this is exposing the patient to small doses of the feared stimulus while they engage in an enjoyable task. So say you were afraid of spiders. Your therapist might put a jar that has a spider in it next to you while you did something that you'd like, or ate a really tasty food. So this would be a process of expecting good things when you see the spider. Another type of classical conditioning is called systematic desensitization. And so this is where a therapist would pair your conditioned stimulus, so whatever your phobia is, with relaxation. So this would get rid of the fear connection to your conditioned stimulus by having you go through breathing exercises or something like that to help you relax in the presence of your phobia. Another type of classical conditioning technique is aversion therapy. And this is actually something that therapists use typically to get you to stop going near something. So here's an example of that.
It's gonna be harder than I thought. Let's try some aversion therapy.
Okay.
Okay?
All right.
All right. So, yeah, look at the picture.
Okay.
All right. And, Ow! Okay, how do you feel now?
Well, I like you less.
Okay, so in the video, Phoebe, the one in the jean dress, the denim dress, is trying to get Rachel to the other girl in the video to not go back to her boyfriend, or not specifically not to attend an attempt to break up his wedding. And so this aversion therapy is the idea that you can create a phobia, almost, of whatever you would like to avoid. So classical conditioning also has an evolutionary significance. There are certain pairings of stimuli that are more likely to become associated than others. For instance, a conditioned food aversion. If you have an association between eating a specific food and getting sick, you'll stop eating that food. This happens even if the illness was caused by something else. So say you were about to get the flu and you ate something and then you threw up. Even though the throwing up was associated with the flu specifically, you may associate it with eating that specific food. I have a friend who ate Mexican food while she was pregnant, and because of morning sickness, threw up soon after eating the Mexican food. And so she began to associate Mexican food with throwing up, and so now she doesn't eat Mexican food anymore. So conditioned food aversions develop really quickly because we need to protect ourselves. And so if you eat something and it makes you sick, you're not going to eat that anymore, because if it's because of the food item, you obviously don't want to eat something that's bad for you. Animals can be associated with certain flavors of food as well. So animals are really good at learning food aversion. And so they don't eat certain foods because they cause illness. Now, if you have a dog or a cat, this is not always the case. For instance, fun fact, most flowers are poisonous to cats. My cat, though, enjoys eating anything green, and so she will eat the leaves, the flowers, the stems, anything, if I have flowers in the house, and will then get really sick and throw up multiple times a day. And so there are certain animals, particularly domesticated animals, that may not learn that getting sick is associated with the food. If you've had a dog who's gotten up on the counter and eaten food, you may know this. But in the wild, animals that associate certain foods with illness are more likely to survive and pass along their genes. And so that's why we also have this ability to determine what's going to make us sick and what's not. Okay, so that is it for classical conditioning. Like I said, I'm going to try to find the office video that I wasn't going to show and upload it to the lecture folder. And if you want to watch it as another example and try to determine the unconditioned stimulus, the unconditioned response, and the conditioned stimulus and the conditioned response, this would probably be really good practice. If you have any questions, let me know, and I look forward to your discussion during the activities. Everybody have a good rest of your week.